Okay, I see a few people are joining. We're just going to wait another minute or two for any stragglers, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Alrighty, welcome to the latest webinar in our JET Alumni Chapter webinar series. We have monthly webinars, and we're really glad to have you joining us on this one. My name is Bahia Simons-Lane. I'm the Executive Director of USJETAA, and today I'll be moderating this webinar on 501c3 basics. First, I'd like to welcome today's speakers, Brenda McKinney, Lauren Sarando, and Joy Champalou, who will be telling us today about their experiences with 501c3 status in their chapters and giving an overview of the process. Please note this webinar is not legal advice and is no substitute for consulting with a lawyer in your state. Before we begin the webinar, I want to briefly introduce USJETAA, the United States-Japan Exchange and Teaching Program Alumni Association. USJETAA is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that furthers the US-Japan relationship by supporting alumni of the JET program. We provide resources for individual JET alumni chapters nationwide, and potential JET participants. We provide the leadership of the 19 US JETAA chapters with support in programming, membership recruitment, chapter management, leadership, professional development, fundraising, and more. If you are on this webinar and you're a JET program alumni and you aren't already a member of USJETAA, please join for free today at usjetaa.org. If you enjoy webinars like this and any of our other programming, please consider donating. We run programs annually for JETAA chapters and individual alumni. Today, I'm going to briefly describe our chapter programs. Please visit usjetaa.org for more information about our other programs. In addition to this webinar series for JETAA chapter leaders, we also facilitate a leadership program funded by Claire, where representatives from USJETAA visit JETAA chapters and subchapters to hold tailored workshops focused on leadership and growth. We accept applications for this program on a rolling basis and are currently looking for another chapter to visit during the 2019-2020 grant year. If you're interested, visit our website and fill out the application form, or just shoot me an email at director@usjetaa.org. Our other chapter program is a partnership with the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA to provide grant funding to JETAA chapters and subchapters to hold events on US-Japan relations in their local communities. Applications for the first round of the 2019-2020 grant year just closed, but if you're interested in applying for the second round, the application is open until October 31st. Please visit our website for more information. Before I turn it over to Brenda, I'd like to let listeners know that we are recording the webinar and we'll post it on our website for those who can't attend. Please hold your questions until the end or type them anytime using the chat or Q&A features. During the Q&A, you can ask any questions that you have about any of the topics or anything that we haven't covered. So now, without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Brenda.
Okay, so hi everyone. This is Brenda in New York City, and I am going to, let's see, are we moving to screen share?
Yes, hold on one second. I'm having some technical difficulties. All right, you should now be able to share your PowerPoint and control.
Okay, so I'm going to start with just explaining what 501c3 is, status is, but before we do that, I'll just start with my introduction and then hand it to the other panelists. So my name is Brenda McKinney, and I was an ALT in Hyogo Prefecture from 2006 to 2009. So I've been involved with JETAA with various chapters since I came back. Went to law school in one city, went to grad school in another city, did a Fulbright in another country, have moved for jobs, and for my spouse who's also a JET alum. So we have had the benefit of getting to know some really amazing JET communities in different cities. And most recently, I was the president of JETAANY in New York City, which is New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, with about 2,000 chapters. And that is also a 501c3. So today I'll talk a little bit about the experiences that I've had with 501c3 status with DC, which Joy is going to talk about, and then New York specifically, but also so I'm also an attorney. I'm licensed in Illinois and New York, and I've worked with nonprofits. But to echo Bahia, and just to state, this is not legal advice, and I'm not forming an attorney-client relationship, but I'm excited to share all of this information, and am absolutely, I welcome questions anytime. Great to be here.
Hi, my name is Lauren Sarando. I was an ALT in Japan, Kumamoto Prefecture from 2012 to 2014. I'm originally from Miami, Florida, so I moved back after my time on JET, and in that way I got involved with the Florida JET Alumni Association in the state of Florida. I first joined in January of 2015 as webmaster for the chapter when we needed one, and then as time went on, got more involved as also newsletter editor, and then I took over presidentship when our previous president, Jennifer Wang, had to move to California. In that time, I was also the JET program coordinator at the Consulate General of Japan in Miami from 2015 until just this May 2019, when I left my job to start a nursing program for a BSN here in University of Florida. But I'm still pretty involved with the Florida JET Alumni Association. I stay in contact with the current president and with the current coordinator to help them. So I am pretty involved with that. Mostly, I'm going to be talking today about the 501c3 application process. Our chapter just went through that this past year, and I spearheaded that, working one-on-one with a lawyer pro bono. So I'm going to be talking about the changes that we had to implement, some of the challenges that we faced, and talk from that first-hand perspective.
And then, hi everyone. So my name is Joy Champalou. I was an ALT in Wakayama Prefecture from 2009 to 2012, and I did Wakayama AJET while on the program. So I'm going to be talking today about JET ADC as a case study after Lauren, after she presents about Florida. The reason being is that I was a member of the JET ADC board for 5 years, first as outreach chair, but then as vice president and president. And I was most recently president of JET ADC from 2016 to 18, and was part of the team that applied for 501c3 status and received it in 2016 from the IRS. And in 2017, we got state recognition from the District of Columbia. And I'll talk a little bit more on the in my slides, but one reason why we applied for 501c3 status when we did was because of the JET 30 reunion, which I hope most of you on the call know about. But Washington, D.C. was the host of the reunion and also of the JETAA USA National Conference in 2017, and we applied for status in order to get some of the sales tax benefits from that. In addition to all these wonderful JETAA memberships, I also participate on the review and interview committees here in Washington, D.C., and I was an application processor back in 2012. So I look forward to a great webinar.
Thanks, Joy. My name is Bahia Simons-Lane. I'm the Executive Director of USJETAA. I was an ALT in Gunma Prefecture from 2005 to 2007. And while I was there, I was the newsletter editor and Tone regional representative for Gunma AJET. And then when I returned to the United States and then moved to Florida, I became active with JETAA Florida, first as newsletter editor and then as president of Florida JETAA for 5.5 years. So I'm very excited to be continuing to work with JETs in my current professional life, and that's very exciting, and I'm happy to be here today. I'll be moderating the webinar today.
Okay, so this is Brenda. I'm just going to jump in and start high level. So we're going to have a couple case studies, but just talking about what 501c3 even means. So when we say 501c3, it really refers to nonprofit status, which everyone on the webinar might already know, but it's basically the tax code. So it means that your group is organized and operated exclusively for exempt purposes. So when we say organization, there's a couple different layers. We'll talk about this, but it means that you are organized like a corporation or you're legally recognized as an organization. So looking at a formal definition or what the IRS recognizes as a 501c3, they're groups that use surplus funds for the public interest. They're considered charitable organizations. They fall under section 501c3 of the IRS code. So it's like the federal laws and regulations, which means that none of the earnings from the organization are distributed to any individual or private shareholder. Nonprofits are considered legal entities and they must be designated as a nonprofit from inception. They're often churches and schools or educational organizations. So it depends on each chapter, and we'll talk a little bit about approach after this slide. But when you become a 501c3, if you decide to do it and go through this process, one of the big questions that you have to think about up front is what kind of 501c3 you are. So I think in DC, and Joy can speak to this, and a lot of chapters, we consider ourselves educational 501c3s. You have to show how you are meeting the purpose of that type of organization or charitable organization, because to fall under the code, you have to meet that those requirements. So an expectation. So the question also is why? So if you're thinking about becoming a 501c3, you're going through the process, or you just want to learn more, you're curious, I think before anything, also look at whether or not it makes sense for your chapter. And it really depends. It might not for every chapter. It's important to weigh the pros, cons, and all other options. So we all have the benefit, as we are on this webinar, hopefully it's very clear, of taking advantage of all of the resources and support that USJETAA offers, for example. And USJETAA is a 501c3, so that's an example of one resource. If there are things that your chapter is interested in doing, maybe there are grants or you have questions about things, you can partner with a nonprofit. Maybe you can go to USJETAA and ask for help. It's not something that maybe makes sense for every chapter all the time. So really walk through this process, think about it up front and those options. This is just a quick recap. So these are things that we could also talk to people about offline, and Bahia knows how to connect us to you, or is a great resource. So some of those pros and cons, just again, high level. The pros, so Joy mentioned that one of the reasons DC became a nonprofit, and one of the big benefits that a lot of chapters that have 501c3 status benefit from is tax exemption. So when we are preparing for events and we're buying, supplies like even sake, things like that, maybe that's not a good example, we don't pay sales tax, you don't pay state taxes, you're tax exempt. You're also eligible for grants and public donations. So hopefully chapters all know about the Sasakawa USA Peace Foundation grants in collaboration with USJETAA, but there's also other types of foundation grants, and even like Giving Tuesday, public donations that you can ask for. But sometimes you need to be a 501c3 to ask for public funds, or to be eligible for government or foundation nonprofit grants. And so that really opens the door to those opportunities. That's sort of a world that could be another webinar with fundraising, but just to know that's a big pro. And then liability. So one of the big things about becoming a nonprofit, especially when like a company or a group or an individual is thinking about becoming a nonprofit or a corporation, a for-profit, if you're starting a business, you have less personal liability if you're a nonprofit. And then there is some prestige that might come with it. If you say we're a nonprofit, sometimes, people have said that gives them a sense of responsibility. I think JETAA, has a lot to pull from anyways. And so you can sell everything that your chapter does without that type of prestige, but just to flag those are some of the pros. Some of the cons, on the other hand, are the limited control. So again, those individuals that might be thinking of starting a nonprofit individually, they don't have as much control over individual decisions. It's going to be part of a group decision based on bylaws. So there's less liability, less control. With the structure of JETAA, it's going to be different in every chapter, and the case studies can speak to structure, but that is less of a concern for us. The expense of applying, I was looking at some statistics, and Gruntspace is one website, for example, and they said that just applying for the federal tax exemption alone, so not thinking about any other fees, is on average $200 to $850. So I'll give you some tips on finding attorneys that don't cost money, but it does cost a lot of money up front. That is something to consider with pros and cons if it's worth it. Ongoing maintenance and rules. So there is a lot of paperwork, and there are some very important deadlines, and it's really important that you take heed of them or cognizant of them. And as JETAA boards roll over, that's something that needs to be constant. So it's something that the entire exec or board needs to partner on, and especially the treasurer. Following bylaws with rules is important. If you were audited by the IRS, that's not likely, it's not something that happens every year, but they could actually look for the notes. If your bylaws say that you're meeting quarterly or have open meetings, your notes are part of those bylaws. And then finances are technically open to public inspection. I haven't heard of that happening, but those are some of the things to consider. So approaching the process, I'll just keep this brief. So when you think about the process, again, maybe just weigh the pros and cons, but think about your senpai. So we, as you know, just like being JETs in Japan and having your go-between at your school if you were an ALT, or having USJETAA as chapters, or even having your exec in your individual chapters, we all have senpais and we are all part of a community. And there are chapters that have been through this. So you're meeting two presidents that have recently gone through this today, Lauren and Joy, and these are resources that you can reach out to and talk to about the process. You'll hear about it. So reach out to others, talk to them, and again, remember USJETAA and come to them with questions. The country reps, you are not alone in this process, but weigh those options and think about it. It's a multi-layered process. So again, organization means legally organized. So it's the legal term of organized. You can be a trust, a corporation, or an association. So most of us incorporate in a state when we become a nonprofit. You can be an unincorporated nonprofit. I'm not going to touch on that because it's something you could talk to a lawyer about, but the benefits actually don't outweigh the cons, I would say, and it's not very common. And legal representation is also really important, strongly recommended. You also need an agent. And again, we went to a senpai when I was in DC when DC started working on this, and got a recommendation for an agent. You need an agent and a lawyer, but start early and start pulling these things together and ask for help. You're not alone in this. So thinking about that representation, this is the last piece I'm going to touch on before we go to the actual case study examples. But the one thing you really need is an attorney. And so you want someone that is experienced with this process, but legal representation can be expensive. So something that we just wanted to flag so that people are aware of it are that you have some options. Lauren mentioned a pro bono attorney, and pro bono basically means donating services. So you might be able to find a lawyer that will do this totally for free. Maybe it's an alum, maybe it's a friend of someone you know. You need to get everything in writing about the costs up front, but that is one option, and it's worked for several chapters, but also legal clinics. So business schools and law schools all have a model. And if you look in your city, again, you can contact us for help looking up what law schools are around, or there's a lot of alumni that are lawyers, so they'll know about this because they probably had to do a clinic in law school or got to do a clinic. But law schools have these clinics, and so it's basically an apprenticeship. So it'll be sort of the third-year law students in their last year, and they're working with nationally renowned lawyers, so these clinical professors who have practiced in big firms, and they will do this process for free. So that application process happens early, sometimes like a year in advance. It all depends on how many cases they already have, how many they need for the students in the clinic, because clinics can be selective. But if they take your case, so you might want to apply to a couple of clinics, the process will actually be free. It's free lawyers, and the benefit of doing that is that everything is looked at by the clinical professors, but they will also keep your files, and law schools are likely to be around for a long time. So if 15 years from now, 20 years from now, someone has a question about 501c3 status and how you filed, it is likely that the members of your exec, even if they can't track you down immediately, they can go to that law school and they probably will still have some files from when you worked on this. I've seen it happen in different clinics, but that's the benefit of working with a clinic in addition to the payment. Again, an agent, we just used a company that was recommended from another senpai, another chapter, actually who USJETAA used. But for law school clinics, before I pass the baton, I just want to show two examples. So I mentioned that I'm in New York City. So we have a number of law schools in New York: Brooklyn Law, Fordham Law, CUNY Law, Columbia, NYU, New York Law School. So you could Google any of those. And if you just Google clinic and the law school name, these are examples of two different options that came up. So NYU Law and New York Law School are two law schools that are sort of by my work in Manhattan. So it's somewhere I could go if I was looking to do this process here, just hypothetically. And here are some clinics. So if you see, you Google and the page pops up, on the sides of these pages, they say 1 semester clinic. That means the students are involved for a semester. But again, they will keep your case because it'll be the same professor for many years working on it, and they'll keep your files. You can see all the different clinics. So if you look at the page to the right of the screen, at the very bottom, it says nonprofit and small business clinic at New York Law School. They're going to be helping people form nonprofit organizations. So most of these schools will have some kind of a clinic, and they'll have free legal representation. If you're not sure, you can apply. You don't have to commit if it doesn't feel right. But this is something we just want to make sure that you're aware of, because it's a free lawyer and they will help you walk through the process and sort of address any issues. So again, we can help you find law schools in your city, or any lawyer, if they've been to law school in your city, will know what all the schools are, but that's one resource. So I'm going to hand over to Lauren next to talk about the case studies, but if there are any questions, we're excited to talk about this process, and feel free to reach out anytime.
Thank you, Brenda. That was such a great, helpful overview. I think it's the perfect place to start when discussing this really complicated topic. Lauren, you should now be able to share your slides and control the screen.
Yes.
I'm going to hand it over to Lauren.
Wonderful, everyone. So again, my name is Lauren. I'm super excited to be here with you guys. So my experience with 501c3 was mainly spearheading the Florida JET Alumni Association's application for 501c3. So before I talk a little bit about what we had to do, I just want to give a little bit of background on our chapter. I think Brenda definitely gave some examples of why you might want 501c3, why you might not want it, what chapters might be big enough, and I think Joy's gonna talk about it as well in the next case study. But in the case of Florida JETAA, essentially we were already a state incorporation with not-for-profit status here in the state of Florida. That's something that was done prior to me joining the board, but essentially our structure is that we have 6 executive officers: a president, vice president, and a treasurer, a secretary, a webmaster, and an information officer. And then we additionally have 8 regional representatives that are appointed by the executive officers. And these regional representatives kind of act like subchapters in other regions. They're essentially responsible for being our point people in certain cities, because our state and our region is so spread out. And so apart from that, we have about 230 registered members throughout the state. and we submitted our application with a 501c3 filing status as an educational organization. Now, why did Florida JETAA want to get 501c3 status? One of the persistent problems that has plagued us as an organization is the fact that because we're so spread out, cohesiveness was an issue, and that was something that we had been working to remedy over the last few years. And we saw that we were gaining steam as an organization, slowly growing, but we held our first ever large event every year we have a large event in Tampa called Tampa Natsumatsuri. And it's a free community festival. It's really big, but not very many people know that it's a JETAA event. And even JET alumni themselves sometimes don't recognize that it's a JETAA event until they go there. But beyond this one program, we wanted to start facilitating programs in other areas, and programs that would also really benefit our members, not just the community. So we were able to hold our first ever career development workshop last year, and it was quite successful. We were able to work together with the Consulate General of Japan in Miami, but we recognize, and with also USJETAA and Sasakawa Peace Foundation, through a grant to hold the event. But we recognized that, if we did not have access to that kind of funding and that kind of collaboration in the future, it would have been very difficult for us to hold something which really was quite a simple event in the grand scheme of things, but was really, really a productive and helpful event for our members. So this is, of course, just one example of programming that we had wanted to do and we were able to do. But prior to that, I had that vision of wanting to expand programming such as that, and make it kind of an annual event. And so monetary independence really was a big driving factor for us as an organization. It's very interesting to solicit funds from people, or not necessarily solicit funds, but if you're holding a fundraiser or you're trying to get donations to do a certain event or do a certain establish a certain program. Like we wanted to establish a college fund for students pursuing Japanese language studies here in the state of Florida to encourage Japanese language programs throughout the state as well. In order to do that, it's very difficult if you don't have 501c3 standing, and it's very difficult or rather, 501c3 does make you sound more official, as Brenda also mentioned earlier. So I think other organizations are more likely to take you seriously and want to collaborate with you if you do have the 501c3 status. And that's why we chose to pursue it. Now, let me know if you can't see me moving slides. Okay, there we go. All right, so in the case of Florida JETAA, and I'm going to be talking about everything in terms of my experience working with it. We had two main challenges in preparing the application. One was making changes to the bylaws, which takes time. And two was budgeting for the application, which takes money. Now, you guys know that time is money, right? And we've all heard that expression before. And that's another really important aspect to consider is it took me about 1 year to finish the application before I even submitted it. And the reason why was because I worked with a pro bono attorney. Now, I was able to find the attorney through my sister, because my sister's an attorney, and so she recommended someone who she thought was very reliable and someone who had integrity and would do this job pro bono for the experience. And so this lawyer, agreed to take it on, but again, time is money, and this lawyer also has a full-time job. So when you're working with someone pro bono, you have to take that into consideration, that you have to have a lot of patience as well, and work with them, and they also have to work with you on your time, because you also presumably have a job and time constraints. So really time was a critical factor in that. And so if you want to move ahead quickly, then there are some things you can start considering and looking at in terms of preparing yourself for the actual 501c3 application. The lawyer that I worked with went document by document, section by section, question by question, over phone calls with me. And in that way, we started recrafting the bylaws for our chapter. So some of the changes in the bylaws that we had to make included standardizing the terminology across our bylaws. So our bylaws were made quite a while back. I think the last time they were ratified was in 2012, before we changed them this past year. And, you know, technically the name of our association is Florida JET Alumni Association Incorporated. So throughout our bylaws, we had JET Alumni Association of Florida, Florida JETAA, and so it was really important to standardize it throughout the entire bylaws and make it look very official. And then also the official JET Japan Exchange and Teaching Program, making sure that that was spelled correctly the same way every single time so that there wasn't a single question, because my understanding is that the process itself, once the application is in, can take quite a while. But if you have anything that triggers a question for the IRS, it's going to take twice as long and make it more complicated for you, and you're going to have to do more explaining. So the less explaining you have to do to the IRS after the first application, the better. And one way to assure that is just to make sure that you cover all your bases by making things as clear as possible and making things as consistent as possible throughout your bylaws. Another thing that was really important for us was to include terminology that aligned us with our chosen designation. In this case, we chose to be considered an educational institution. Before, our bylaws included a sentence that just said, you know, Florida JETAA promotes Japan and Japanese culture in the form of nonprofit community, cultural, and social events on a grassroots level. As you can see, all this red stuff got added in, and this is not the full definition or mission statement for our chapter, but this just kind of gives an idea of how specific you might want to be, or a lawyer may, you know, that you consult may encourage you to be, so that there's no question about your role as an educational institution. And as you see, it also mentions charitable events. So as former assistant language teachers, there you're establishing your curriculum education in the past. In Japanese schools, our goal is to promote a broader and deeper knowledge of Japanese culture and language through our local Florida chapter activities and charitable events, thus playing an important role in the promotion of peace and mutual understanding between the people of Japan and the United States. So that also establishes a purpose for your connection with organizations like CLARE and organizations like the Consulate General of Japan in whatever region you're in if you're working with them. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about those institutions later. But another thing that we really had to work on was adding a section that really covered our legal and fiscal restrictions as an organization. Brenda had also touched upon this earlier, but as a 501c3, there is a concern with people who are involved in leadership getting kickbacks or making a profit because, well, we are a non-profit organization. So basically that section had to go in and explicitly state, you know, how we're going to be using our funds, for what activities we're going to be using them, how we're going to fundraise, etc. And then also basically act as a disclaimer for who won't be getting funds. Basically your executive officers, anyone else that's in any position of running an event, etc. Another thing we had to add was a disillusion clause, which we had never really thought about as an organization, I think, and I'm not sure if others have either, but essentially this covers what happens to your money or your assets if your organization disappears. If let's say tomorrow all your executive officers decide that they don't want to be executive officers anymore and it will be their jobs, and nobody else steps up to the plate. What's going to happen to all the money that was raised, that people gave, that other organizations gave, like, you know, the grants that came in, etc.? Where does that go? And that, as much as we'd like to hope that that never happens, the reality is there have been times, especially for Florida JETAA and I think other chapters, where we've had trouble either retaining people on the board or engaging membership enough to have them want to be in positions of leadership. That's another problem on its own that I think we need to address as chapters and as chapter leaders. But one of the main issues really is the dissolution clause, because at the end of the day, that's not your money, that's the organization's money. So deciding who you're going to give that to, and it can be another charitable organization. In principle, I believe it should be a nonprofit. But you know, Florida JETAA decided that we would give that money in the dissolution clause to USJETAA, because that way, if for whatever reason our chapter was ever dissolved, at least the money could go to help other chapters for JETAA throughout the US. In terms of membership, you also have to put information on who is included, who is allowed to be part of your chapter. Technically, you can't discriminate against certain people. Well, obviously you can't discriminate against certain people based off of religion and race, etc. But you also believe can't discriminate against people who are not JETs, etc. And then dues. You know, does your chapter collect dues? How much are your dues? When are they collected? How are they collected, etc.? Where can you go to sign up for your chapter, including the website? It's something that was very specific. Then also detailing executive officers and elections, specifically how your officers are elected, when, down to dates, your election cycle, your nomination cycle, and voting methods, how people may access the polls, etc. And then regions or subchapters, if you have them. If you don't have them, but you're thinking of instituting some, I think that it's always a good idea to have it in your bylaws so that you can then feel free to add them or remove them if they're not working anymore or there's no one there to take over. But we included language: the executive board shall reserve the right to add, remove, or adjust currently existing regions to accommodate fluctuation of membership concentration. We had to do that with one of our regions because, frankly, we had, I think, maybe 3 people in our Pensacola region. And we had a rep there, but he wasn't active. And so whenever we tried to get them to do something or anything like that, they weren't very responsive. So it was no longer appropriate to have them as a full region. One of the last things we added, I think, to our bylaws was the option of having a board of directors, especially moving forward if we become a 501c3 corporation, or we gain that status. We would really like to institute, ideally, a board of directors. And I think this is something that maybe Bahia and Brenda could touch upon a little bit more, but having a board of directors seems like a very good idea for any JETAA chapter, regardless of whether you have 501c3 status or not. But the idea behind the board of directors is not necessarily to control the actions of JETAA, but to have someone who is consistently there, who has been involved maybe in the past, or you know, acts as a reference point when all of these kinds of transitions are going on. So, for instance, if I were a member of the board of directors from Florida JETAA, I may not be making, you know, policy decisions for the present board, but because I have access to the information on the 501c3 policy, if I'm on the board for 10 years, because it's not an elected position, then they can reach out to me to ask questions about what happened 10 years ago when we applied for 501c3. It's kind of a similar premise to what Brenda mentioned about using a law clinic, where you can go ahead and talk with the clinic go through their records to find out what the filing status was when it was instituted. And this is, of course, presuming we're talking about future boards that had no involvement whatsoever in the application process. Some other things that you'll have to mention in your bylaws include funding. You know, they want to know, it's the IRS, so they want to know where your money's coming from. Grants, donations, fundraising. We ended up having to also submit 5 years worth of bank statements from our organization. So you're going to have to get in touch with past treasurers as well and find out where those records are. You can black out lines. For example, if your treasurer used their own bank account, you can black out lines for their personal transactions and just show the transactions of funding that came in for JETAA or went out for JETAA from organizations like CLARE, etc. And then you also need to have information on conflict of interest. This goes back to making sure that no one's making a profit from working for the organization. Or, for example, if I have a balloon company and I'm on the board of directors and I say, okay, well, you guys can just buy all the balloons for any event from me, and those are the only ones that you guys should buy. There's obviously a conflict of interest there because I'm making money off of it. If I say, oh, well, you know, I can just charge Florida JETAA, you know, the wholesale price that I buy the balloons for, so you're basically getting them at the same price that I would buy them for and I'm not making a profit, that's not really a conflict of interest. But basically the purpose of this policy and agreement is to have financial transparency, establish protocol for handling any conflict of interest that may arise in the future. And for this reason, it absolutely has to be ratified. So our conflict of interest policy and agreement was added as an appendix at the end of our new bylaws. Everyone signed, and then as president representing the board, I signed the conflict of interest policy and agreement. And then a few extra things to think about for filing is just you are going to have to explain programs like the JET program, CLARE, and the Consulate General of Japan. In our case in Miami, we had our attorney, at least, again, this is not any kind of legal recommendation, but this is my experience. Our attorney insisted that we had to write out an explanation of what the JET program was, what CLARE was, and what the Consulate General of Japan in Miami was, and then explain our relationships with them. Because in some cases we were receiving, well, we all received money from CLARE every year. We received money from the Consulate General of Japan in some cases for certain events. And then the JET program itself is mentioned a lot in our bylaws and is, of course, the core of why we exist. So having that explained and establishing that we are separate from them, especially because it's a foreign government, and you don't want the IRS to think that we are a foreign agent working here, and that otherwise we wouldn't be eligible for the 501c3. Finally, one of our biggest humps was a filing fee. It costs $600 regardless of your situation to apply to file Form 1023, which is required to file for 501c3 status. That's money that we did not have. We don't have membership dues. We don't really have much of anything that we can sell our constituents. So we had raised some money, but we didn't have quite enough, and we were able to do a GoFundMe, and we were very grateful that a lot of our members were willing to, donate to the GoFundMe so that we could have the money to file for this, and hopefully we'll see that pay off in the future. Other than that, I am very excited to answer any questions you guys may have in the end. Again, our status is still pending. We're not sure when we're going to hear from the IRS, but I spoke with our attorney recently, and usually no news from the IRS is good news. So we'll hopefully be back to talk with you soon and give an update on the Florida status. But at this point, I would like to go ahead and turn over the mic to Joy.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Let me get my PowerPoint presentation set up. One moment. Okay, hopefully everyone can see my screen, but hi everyone, this is Joy Champalou. I was president of JET ADC from 2016 to 2018 again. So I'm going to quickly give you JET ADCs as a case study, but kind of going on a little bit different track from Lauren's presentation, and I'm going to go as quickly and concisely as I can, since I know we want to open it up for questions at the end of this webinar. So essentially, for this one, I want to just emphasize for JET ADC that it took a long journey for us. It was not, it didn't happen over the course of 1 or 2 years. It was not only from my presidency, and it was not the achievement of one person or one board. It was a process that started in 2007, where JET ADC rewrote its bylaws with 501c3 status in mind. And in addition, previous boards from 2009 to 2012 paid for and wrote their articles of incorporation and paid for incorporation status in the District of Columbia, and also filed and received a FEIN number, or Federal Employer's Identification Number. And so these three things were already in place when I joined JET ADC in 2013, and it was not until 2016 that we decided to go ahead and pursue it. So for any chapters who are on the call and are thinking that maybe this year 501c3 status is not feasible for you, I would highly recommend you also looking into whether you have the time, or if you think it would be feasible for your chapter to maybe just rewrite your bylaws with 501c3 status in mind, keeping in mind all of Lauren's great points in the previous presentation. In addition, if you would like protection for your chapter, I also highly recommend incorporating yourself at least into an LLC in order to give you and your officers protection as well on your activities. And go ahead and you will need an identification number for that. And so for me, also in 2016, I just want to quickly note the importance of, yes, as Brenda mentioned, hiring or finding a pro bono lawyer or a law clinic to help you in this process. Brenda was very essential in getting us the law clinic in Washington, D.C. to help us through this process. And I do not recommend to any chapter going through this process without local state help. You will need it for the entire process. With that being said, why 2016, 2017 made sense for JET ADC? We are one of the largest chapters in the United States. We have, I believe, over 800 members in the Washington, D.C. area, which also includes Maryland and Virginia. So we had the membership for many years. We have a very robust yearly schedule of activities, and the board in 2016 was, I believe, 14 or 15 board members. So we were quite large. So the good news was we were large enough at that time to sustain a status and going into the future. The other thing that was happening from 2012 onwards was USJETAA was looking at forming and seeking 501(c3) nonprofit status. There was a conversation during those years whether or not they could serve as an umbrella 501c3 for all 19 chapters in the United States. However, they did decide ultimately, can't remember if it was 2014 or 15, that they decided they will not be seeking umbrella status for all the chapters. If any chapters going forward would like to apply for status, they would have to do so themselves. And then finally, as I mentioned in my original introductions, that JET ADC, or Washington, D.C. was going to be hosting the national conference in 2017 and also be the site for the JET 30 reunion. And therefore, as Lauren mentioned, 501c3 status is very expensive. You have to consider the IRS filing status, registered agent if you're going to pay for one, and also maintenance fees going forward. So it does add up into hundreds of dollars that you will need to consider when filing. However, because we were hosting the national conference in Washington, D.C., the sales tax benefits that we would save from not paying tax on everyone's hotels and the restaurants for 50, 60 delegates and so forth, it made fiscal sense for us to then apply for it. And in 2017, we were recognized, in the District of Columbia, which was valid for 2 years. So since Lauren gave a great presentation on how to apply for a 501c3 status from the IRS, I'm going to be talking a little bit more on how to apply for state recognition of your tax exemption status once you get your letter of determination from the IRS. So this is something that was a bit of a surprise for me. I naively thought that once I applied for the IRS that I would get that sales tax exemption certificate in the mail and we would be done. Unfortunately, just as anything, once you file for the federal recognition, you have to then apply for state recognition as well. You'll have to check your local taxation office. For DC, it was the Office of Tax and Revenue. And so in your state, it would likely be something similar. One thing to note, you'll have to file for every state you intend to operate in. Since JETAA mostly conducts all of our operations in the District of Columbia, we only applied for DC recognition in 2017. However, the current board is looking for ways into applying for Maryland and Virginia as well. But the two things you should be looking out for your local taxation office is how to apply for a state sales exemption certificate and also a charitable solicitations registration or license. So the state sales tax exemption certificate, it enables you to make tax-free purchases that would normally be subject to sales tax. For example, food and beverages, if you're going to have a happy hour at your local restaurant, if you're applying for hotel rooms, for an outside speaker, and so forth, that would be where you can use it. However, again, it is only usually applicable in the state you applied for tax exemption status. And the second thing is a charitable solicitations license. That enables you to actually solicit donations. So if that's not something you intend to do, so donations being monetary donations in the form of grants or just your members donating to your chapter, you don't need to get that technically. Or like in the District of Columbia, you can apply for a charitable exemption license instead, which is free. So that's something to look out for. I'm just going to quickly go over some terminology that, or documents we had to provide for the District of Columbia. You may or may not have to apply for this in your state, but there may be something similar. So one is the Articles of Incorporation, which is different than your bylaws. The second is the IRS determination letter, which is the letter you receive from the IRS stating that your 501c3 status has been approved. For DC, we had to provide what they called a clean hands self-certification, which was essentially a signed statement from me, the president, certifying that the organization doesn't owe any outstanding taxes or payments to the district. And lastly, it was a certificate of occupancy or deed for the building that we are going to be operating out of. And so that for us was the trickiest to track down, and I'll kind of explain that in our lessons learned. But in summary, that's kind of what we had to provide in order to get the certificate and the registration license. So for lessons learned, one thing to note is when you're applying for the status, be very aware of what you're putting down as your business address, since it acts in many different ways and not just where you'll be collecting mail. So for JET ADC, it made the most sense because all of our officers are spread across DC, Maryland, and Virginia. A lot of us live in the suburbs. We don't actually live in the district itself. We decided that the best place for us would be to put the JET program office at the Embassy of Japan as our business address, because that's where we will be collecting mail, and that is where we hold our meetings, and that is where we know that years to come, the future boards would be able to have something consistent. Fortunately, by putting the Embassy of Japan's address, and since we're in the District of Columbia, which is just very strict on any foreign government funding or activities, we initially were denied. So we had to provide more proof that we first actually conducted our business activities at the embassy itself. So for that, we had to basically send us a letter attesting, no, we do have, for example, our annual general meetings at the embassy. We have our monthly meetings sometimes at the embassy. And many of us do business there, and the JET office was very helpful in that regard. The second thing, though, is that certificate of occupancy I mentioned. Come to find out, it's a document that ensures that the building passes zoning regulations and building codes. And so we had to go track down the Embassy of Japan's, or the JET program office, which is housed in the Embassy of Japan's building certificate. These are public documents, so we were able to go down to the DC tax office and pay for a copy of it, and provide that as well. The other thing we had to do was provide a lease agreement that we have the permission of the JET program office to operate out of the Embassy of Japan. So this is something that the JET office helped us put together. But again, we had to corroborate or provide proof that we conducted our main activities there, and also additional proof that we do have educational activities in the District of Columbia, and that we are providing benefits to the community. And so this is why, for me personally, I think it's a good practice for all chapters to be writing up recaps, posting pictures after all of your events, because it is these sorts of practices that we had to then utilize when we were applying for status, to show that, no, we are doing, we do have educational activities within the district itself, not in Japan or anywhere else, and that we are providing benefit to community. And one thing that was very helpful, I think, was through, coincidentally, the SOSCA USC grant previous years, JET ADC hosted a Japan Day with the local Big Brothers Big Sisters. And the Big Brothers Big Sisters wrote up a really nice recap and posted pictures on their website. So we not only had proof from our website that this event happened in the district, but also we could share the link to the Big Brothers Big Sisters website and kind of have both of our websites as proof. And so after providing all of this information, the District of Columbia finally gave us a 2-year license that future boards will have to renew, and that the current JET ADC board just renewed this year. So the last slide for me is just maintaining and utilizing your 501c3 status. So as mentioned, there's many costs and steps to maintain. And sorry, I know that I'm running short on time, so I'm going to be very quick. But one is filing a 990N postcard annually with the IRS. So this is something free. It's kind of like filing your taxes with the IRS, but it's simple, free to use, and you have to do, your treasurer should do this every year to report your income. So for example, your GIA funds from CLARE, any grants, etc. Secondly is paying at registered agent fees annually if you did hire one. And third is maintaining your incorporation and tax exemption status in each state you operate in. That will vary, so check your local state. The other important tip is you have to have clear communication and designation of roles. So for JET ADC, we established a 501c3 task force committee, which included the president, treasurer, and any relevant officers. For example, Brenda, because she was professional development chair at the time and also attorney, she was a crucial role in that task force. For the current JETAADC board, I know that they have the president, treasurer, and also another board member who has filed for 501c3 status with their office, and so she's been a critical member of that board as well. And any future recruitment must also keep the maintenance of your status in mind. And because of all of this, you have to constantly be doing a cost-benefit analysis. Doesn't make fiscal sense for you to pursue this. For us, because we had the sales exemption certificate and we can now accept donations and apply for grants, it made sense for JETAADC. And I will leave it there and open it to questions, I believe.
Yes, we are running short on time. I think we're going to go straight into questions. Oops, hold on, let me. There we go. Eric had a question that Brenda answered in the chat, and I'm hoping that Brenda can go ahead and just very briefly answer the question. The question was, as a 501c3, do meeting minutes from your board of directors or your executive committee, elected officers, need to be publicly available? And do the bylaws need to be publicly available?
So this is Brenda. So I put, so that question was in the chat and then I just responded to it there. And then just to echo what Joy had just pointed out, part of the reason why we recommend law school clinics is that not only do you have that ongoing representation, but it's local representation, because the rules can vary. IRS is federal, obviously, but rules can vary by state. And so having local guidance, but also local expertise is important, because it's not one size fits all. So I'll give you a general answer, but the documents basically need to be provided upon request. That request might never come up. So some nonprofits post their bylaws. JETAANY has them on their site. USJETAA might be a source for helping you find bylaws. It really varies by the organization. You could also go to the state where that nonprofit is incorporated and ask for their documents. So that's what it means by publicly available. When you file, people can request that information, but hopefully that answers it. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen or that you have to provide them. You just have to have access to them, which again, to echo Joy, is why organization can be important, especially with turnover. I mean, we have 70,000 JET alumni now in 42 countries, maybe more than that. But so, you know, there's people coming back from Japan and it's great to get them involved, but there's natural change in execs and boards. And so, you know, you just want to make sure you're maintaining that, whether it's Google Drive or whatever. So that's a simple, it's like a complicated but simple answer. And then I posted a link to a tutorial video that the IRS posts on this. So there are IRS, their materials are going to be trustworthy, but there are things, even if you Google like tutorials on this, because it's not straightforward, but that's another reason, like these are the types of things that an attorney would guide you through, and your Senpai chapters that go through this, especially like the treasurers in the chapters, can help you with.
And I have, this is Becky, I just have something quick to add. So in terms of the bylaws, I think it's a good practice for JETAA chapters to include your bylaws on your website. It really legitimizes you as a chapter, as like a professional organization, if especially potential funders or grantors don't have to hunt for that information, even though they can get it through other methods. The other thing I would like to add is, so we recently opened a savings account for USJETAA, and they absolutely did require not only a copy of our bylaws at the bank, but also some of our meeting minutes. So you never know when that might be needed. So it's a good practice to make sure that you are recording that information.
Yeah, and transparency is always good too.
So we had another question come in. Can anyone, from Kelly, can anyone speak on the differences between LLC status and 501c3 status?
I can take that one too, but just, so I know that sometimes, so LLCs technically, it's a limited liability corporation. So you have that limited liability. So when you incorporate with a state or become a corporation, there's different types of corporation, and there are reasons for doing that. And that, I would say LLC, okay, I'm going to back up. This is complicated, so it's something that I would work with. Basically, one is like a for-profit and one is a nonprofit. You can be an LLC and a nonprofit, but it's a little bit complicated. So without getting into the minutiae or the details, that's something to talk to a lawyer about. However, limited liability corporation or an LLC is usually a for-profit company. They do not have tax-exempt status usually, and then that limits, so like the stakeholders or the shareholders or those people getting profit from the corporation will get benefits from that. And then there are different regulations and rules, like when you close, Lauren was talking about what happens to the profits from a nonprofit. They're never going to go to the individuals that are working with that nonprofit, right? But they go to another nonprofit or something. With a limited liability corporation, there might be different regulations than with other types of corporations, and laws around the amount of liability you have. So they're just technical differences with your legal liability. I am wary of giving legal advice or treading into that territory, just to be really candid. So I could talk about this offline, but basically it's like a for-profit, non-exempt, tax-exempt, and those are things to talk to a lawyer about. I don't think any of the chapters are LLCs, and for a reason, but it's a good question. It's just a type of corporation, and there's different types. This is also when you take the bar exam in any state, or if you take corporate law, or biz orgs, they call it, business organizations in law school. There's a whole course about it, and all they go over are the differences between these types of corporations. So it can be a little complicated, but that's a high level answer. I hope that helps.
One thing I'd like to add about that is one thing that chapters can look into is within their specific state is becoming a registered nonprofit in that state. Whether or not you plan to pursue the 501c3 status, that's what we did in Florida initially. And some benefits of that is you may still have to file taxes. I believe that you do. I'm not a lawyer. But it can allow you to get your federal EIN, which can help in creating a bank account for your chapter. I know many chapters have struggled with creating bank accounts for their organization and not having money come through a personal bank account, which is not a good practice. So that could be something that you might want to look into, even if you're not pursuing 501c3.
Yeah. I'll just add one other thing. That charitable organization is really a key difference. An LLC is limited liability, but it's going to be a corporation where the liability, it's not for a charitable purpose. And I think with JETAA specifically, if we're looking at chapters, there's more than an argument. There's actually precedent that we are, for example, educational organizations. When we were going through this with DC, we talked to California and some other chapters about how they had incorporated in their status. So it's also what's most appropriate in the context. And if you're only looking at JETAA, there are reasons why you might want to consider why it's a charitable organization.
Thank you, Brenda. And then there's a final question from Debbie. How many out of the 19 chapters have 501c3 status? I'll go ahead and take that one. I may not be 100% accurate on this, but I believe that it is about 7. New York, DC, Minnesota, Northern California, Southern California, Pacific Northwest, Great Lakes, and soon Florida. It's possible that there are others that I don't know about because I do not have copies of the bylaws for all of the chapters. Anyway, that's something I'm working on. But I believe it's about 7, so a little bit less than half of the 19. All right, we're really over. I think there's a lot of great other things that we could talk about. I'm going to throw out a few questions if people could just take very, very quickly and answer. So first, what are the benefits of 501c3 in terms of what can you do now that you couldn't do before you had status? Maybe Brenda or Joy could take this.
I can quickly take this. We kind of mentioned it on the call too, but essentially now JETAADC is able to save money through their sales tax exemptions, using their sales tax exemption certificate. And they can, with the solicitation license, you can also now solicit the grants and donations that we could not legally do beforehand. That being said, I think in many states, of course, if you're doing it on a small end, that's fine. It's just you can't apply for formal grants like at the Japan Foundation or other grants in the formal process and receive that money. That's also why for SOSCO USA, we have partnered with USJETAA and we're giving them, you guys, grants officially, and then it's a mini grant process. But organizations like SOSCO USA cannot formally partner and give money in large sums to non-501c3 nonprofits.
I totally echo what Joy said. And then something to also consider if you are a 501c3 is that if you know somebody that works for one of the big 4 accounting firms, for example, there's somebody that, you know, has been a country rep that works for one of them, and they just fill out a form and can have $500 basically to give to a nonprofit. Like some certain corporations, foundations, companies will donate to nonprofits, and it's a lot easier. You're able to accept those funds. So it's something that different chapters are exploring, but we haven't done a lot about. But as we do, you know, we look at like the 30th anniversary of the JET program or of our chapters. It's coming up in JETAANY next year, JETAA in New York. Like if, you know, those grants, that funding can maybe be helpful. You could have a scholarship fund. We're eligible for those things as a 501c3. And those taxes also add up, I will say. Like even going to mini golf, if you don't have to pay tax, that's costs that you can save on for your members.
Thank you. All right, so before we wrap up, I just want to add one final thought, which is basically how USJETAA can help, especially if you're not a 501c3 organization. You do always have the option to partner with a 501c3 organization to do a specific program. Many chapters have partnered, for example, with USJETAA or with the Japan America Societies, many of which are 501c3 organizations, or with universities. And so I always strongly encourage chapters to consider whether they really need 501c3 status, because it is a complicated, expensive process. And you should really make sure there are going to be some benefits for your specific chapter, the way your chapter is organized and what your needs are. And so in any way that USJETAA can help, we're certainly available to do so. And whether that means, you know, accepting donations for chapters, as long as they're approved purposes based on what USJETAA is able to do. For example, with the Sasakawa grant, we partner with Sasaka USA so that we can then provide the funding to the JETAA chapters, regardless of whether they are a 501c3 organization or not. So I encourage you, if there's something you want to do, but you are not sure if you can do it without 501c3 status, please come to us and we'll help you figure out whether we can help you do it, or whether we can find out more information about what you need to be able to do it.
Thank you so much, Bahia. Again, this is Lauren from Florida JET Alumni Association. I also just want to go ahead and add that for any chapters that are currently exploring 501c3 status as a, you know, potential for the future, the bylaws for Florida JET Alumni Association that were ratified this year, I believe in April or March, are up on the Florida JETAA website. So you're able to go ahead and see what our full new ratified bylaws look like. These were the bylaws that were, you know, updated specifically for the application for 501c3 status. It includes all the aspects that I mentioned earlier that were recommended by our lawyer. Again, that is our personal legal counsel. So I would always recommend, confirming with legal counsel, whether it's a clinic or someone that agrees to do it pro bono, with what is necessary for you and your state, but just so you can get an idea, it's there.
Thank you. Thank you all for your patience and sticking with us, even though we ran a little bit late. This is such a complicated topic, and I just want to thank Brenda, Lauren, and Joy for taking the time to talk to us about it. Again, if this is something that you would like to do with your chapter, I strongly encourage you to find some legal help, pro bono or a law clinic to help you with it, and also to evaluate whether you really need it. Thank you so much, Brenda, Lauren, and Joy. We really appreciate it. And for those of you listening, our next webinar is on July 23rd. It's going to be on No Nonsense LinkedIn Basics just for JETs. We hope you'll attend or share it with your chapter members. This webinar is going to be helpful for JETs and JET alumni who are looking to fully utilize LinkedIn for networking and careers. And the presenter will be Kamara Tofolo, who was a JET with me in Gunma, and is now a professional LinkedIn master. Please check out our website and our Facebook page for more information, and you can also like us on Facebook to receive a notification and updates when we schedule webinars. Stay tuned for the recording of this, which will be posted next week. It'll be available on the USJETAA website, Facebook page, and the Facebook event page. Thank you again for joining tonight's webinar, and we hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Bahia.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.